Sorry about that. So, again, a lot of women will join the war movement by selling war bonds, by organizing rallies, as well as working in production jobs that will be vacated by men who are serving in the Army or Navy. It's also during this time that we get the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is ratified in 1920. And the 19th Amendment will give women the right to vote. Okay, so we get that. We actually just had the centennial celebration last year, 100 years of women having the right to vote. However, does this apply to all women? No, not necessarily, because if you were an African American woman at this time, you probably weren't able to vote because there were so many restrictions uh, on suffrage from Black people in particular. So, if you were a white woman at this time, it gives you the right to vote. It's also during this time, and I love talking about this because it really answers or really asks a really good question. So we also have prohibition at this time. Prohibition is a time in the United States where intoxicating drinks will be banned. So it really gains prohibition, or I'll say temperance, the movement to keep people from drinking, really gains a lot of national success during the war. And you have a number of people who will agree with prohibition or at least agree with temperance. So you have a lot of employers who hope that banning alcohol or by restricting alcohol that it will create a better workforce. A lot of urban reformers who were really wanting a more orderly city environment really hoped that temperance would undermine some of these political machines that use saloons as a place to organize. And a lot of women at this time were hoping to protect wives and children from husbands who would engage in domestic violence or acts of domestic violence when they would get drunk, or husbands who squandered their wages at saloons. And so prohibition really opens up the question of, is it the government's job to regulate morality? And you also ask the question of why. Why would you have a movement to stop people from drinking at this time? So, the problem here, or what is seen as a problem, I would say, even towards the turn of the 20th century, you see a lot more people drinking. Now, alcohol had been a part of not just American life and American history, but quite literally human history forever. So, wine, beer, cider, other fermented drinks have been really a part of human history. It was actually in some places and in many eras safer to drink beer than it was to drink water because the water could be contaminated. The beer isn't going to kill you, but the water might. And so it's not that alcohol had been or had not been available. It had been available for quite a long time. However, by the time we get to the 1800s, people are starting to drink heavier drinks. It's not just beer, it's not just cider, it's not wine. Now you're getting to the beverages such as rum, which is produced by sugar in plantations. So sugar plantations were very, very profitable during enslavement, especially in the Caribbean islands. You also have a lot of people who are growing grains and corn, and all of these things can be fermented down into whiskey. By 1830, the average American over 15 years of age drank the equivalent of about 88 bottles of whiskey per year. I'll repeat that because you're probably like, no, Professor T, you're definitely lying. I am definitely not lying. I'm telling the truth. By 1830, the average American above the age of 15 drank the equivalent of 88 bottles of whiskey per year. That's three times the amount of their 21st century uh, counterparts. No one in this era drinks that much. And there are problems that come with that. So if you are an employer, Yeah, you want to create a better workforce because you don't want your workers drinking. If you're an urban reformer, you probably want to break down these saloons. But especially for women, and this is probably why women were so involved in the temperance movement. If we recall, this is an era where women don't have many rights. This is an era where spousal abuse isn't really discovered or isn't really discussed. It's not uh, common. You know, you may not get protection from the police because you're married, and there is a concept of marital privacy. The idea of spousal rape isn't discussed, and so you can't discuss some of these other issues, but you can discuss what is causing some of these issues. You can say, I don't like alcohol because when my husband is drunk, he beats me or he beats our children, or we are starving. We don't have enough. We don't have money to provide for ourselves because my husband, instead of bringing his money home, he goes to the bar and he is spending his whole check on alcohol. So you can discuss these issues. And so, really, since the temperance has been had been a movement since the 1800s. And in your last chapter, we talked about the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or the WCTU, which began in the 1800s to reform, as a reform movement, to restrict alcohol. Now, prohibition, I'll say, and I'll end with this because I could have an entire lecture. And when I was teaching in person, I did have an entire lecture on prohibition. But a lot of people, when they talk about prohibition, or when they voted to support prohibition, they did so with the idea that certain things would still be allowed, that wine would still be allowed, that beer would still be allowed, and that only the very, or I would say, highly intoxicating beverages would be banned. However, in practice, prohibition banned anything with even the most like minute amount of alcohol. So in practice during prohibition, um, vanilla extract would have been banned. Mouthwash would have been banned. And so, how did people stop drinking during Prohibition? No, they did not. People didn't stop drinking. Instead, people just got very creative. So, for one, doctors could prescribe whiskey for certain ailments. And so you would see a lot of members of the same family come down with the same ailment to be able to get their whiskey. If you were Jewish, if you were a rabbi, you could get a certain amount of sacramental wine. And so you started to see a lot of people become rabbis. You had Black rabbis and Irish rabbis. And it's like, you're not a rabbi, you're Rabbi O'Shanahan. What's going on here? So people found their own ways to get around prohibition. Now, what if you sold wine? What would you do then? You had some companies that would say, this is grape juice. Do not do X, Y, and Z, because if you do X, Y, and Z, it will become wine, and that is illegal. So essentially, they're saying not to do the very, careful instructions that they put on the label in order for it to not ferment. Don't let this ferment, because if you do this, this, and this, it will ferment and it will become wine. So people found ways to get around prohibition. Also, what prohibition did is it created an underworld. It created I would say, a whole gangster like underworld, because the demand for alcohol didn't go down. And so you just needed someone to create the supply. And since it's not being sold legally anymore, you can sell it for whatever you want because it's the black market. And you will have a lot of people who will honestly just not enforce prohibition. You have a lot of police officers who will not enforce it. So there are lots of problems with prohibition. And so there was probably more drinking during prohibition than there was prior to Prohibition. There are even stories of police officers, one police officer in Seattle, and I cannot recall his name. As soon as I'm done with this lecture, I'm sure I will recall his name. But he is a police officer. He ended up getting his whiskey from Canada because he was relatively close, and he would sell it. He ends up being found out. He is dismissed or fired from his job as a police officer, and his remark was good because now I'm able to devote more time to bootlegging. It's during like bootleggers made so much money. He could make more money on one bootlegging trip than he made, an entire year than he would have made in an entire year on the force. It was highly, highly, highly profitable. And so a lot of city officials knew about what was going on. Many of them were being paid for what was going on. So prohibition, it does not stop drinking. It does not stop crime. It does not stop corruption. Instead, it creates an entire underworld because there is still a demand. And so now you have different people supplying the booze. Okay. So we will continue. We'll go forward. I digress with prohibition because I could go on and on. But you have any questions about prohibition, please send me an email, students. I would love to answer your question. And then also, here's another assignment. Is it the government, and this is just a discussion that we can have, but is it the government's responsibility to regulate individual morality? We're seeing this now with different countries that are saying, different states that are allowing, for example, drug use, who are saying, I'm not going to make drugs illegal. Is it the government's job, whether state or federal or local, is it their job to regulate morality? That is a huge question that even we still have today, 100 years after Prohibition. So, anyways, now I digress. Okay, so 1917, the Espionage Act. So, once we enter the war effort, you have a lot of suspicion. More than 2,000 people will be charged with violating espionage laws. So, the Espionage Act of 1917 stated or prohibited spying or interfering with the draft. It also made false statements illegal. So if you made any false statement that could impede with military success, that would be in violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. So again, it prohibited spying, it prohibited interfering with the draft in any way, including making any false statements that might interfere with the draft. And then the Sedition Act, which was passed in 1918, made it a crime to make spoken or printed statements that would cast, quote, contempt, scorn, or disrepute, end quote, on the government, or that advocated with interference or advocated interference with the draft. So the Sedition Act made it a crime to make any spoken or printed statements that would interfere with the war effort or that would cause or cast contempt, scorn, or disrepute on the government. Now, the most prominent victim of these laws was Eugene Debs. So Eugene Debs was a socialist. He ran for president in 1912 and was defeated, but he is the most famous victim of these acts. When we have acts that make it illegal to say false statements, or make it illegal to cast scorn upon the government, so that is what sedition is. If you are just casting scorn on the government, that is coercive patriotism. That is something that, you're not patriotic because you want to be patriotic. It's just a crime not to be patriotic. It's coercive. So during World War I, we definitely see a test of American patriotism. The American Protective League, or the APL, was an organization that would identify any person who was deemed radical or a critic of the war. And so many people, or many members of the APL, would spy on their neighbors, and they would carry out, quote unquote, these slacker raids where they would break into offices and break into homes to try to find evidence of people being radical or people being critical of the war effort. Thousands of men would be stopped on the street, and they would be required to show their draft registration cards. If they could not show their draft registration cards, they could be arrested. So, really, the purpose of the APL was to try to find radicals and draft dodgers. Okay, so that is coercive patriotism. Now, there's also a lot of tension that is rising up in the country because of the nation's increasing ethnic diversity. There is this desire for Americanization, or the creation or of a more homogenous society. So newcomers were expected to just merge into the American identity, just merge into this American nationality. And at the time, since we were fighting Germany in World War I, Germans will really bear the brunt of forced Americanization. They are forced to prove their loyalty in America versus any loyalty they may have to the nation that they fled, being Germany. Really, African Americans at this time, and hopefully this comes to no surprise, were pretty excluded from the progressive definition of freedom, because if freedom meant industrial freedom and being able to join unions and being able to have skilled employment that would pay a great wage, then African Americans, or I would say a livable wage, then African Americans are definitely excluded from that. African Americans were barred from joining unions. They could not get skilled employment, and skilled employment would offer better paying positions. Now, something I always really like to discuss when I'm discussing Woodrow Wilson is Birth of a Nation. So go. I'll pause, and we'll have a very short part four for this chapter. So I'll see you in just a bit.